Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. This is the story time of when I left the boarding school and what happened. So I don't remember when this was. So I left, I think, 3.5 weeks into my year 12. I was in the sixth form at the boarding school. And partway through this week, I find out that the school is going to tell the local authority that I wasn't living in that catchment area anymore, so I wouldn't have funding for the school. I was planning to leave, but this kind of expedited it. And so it comes to my last day, and I've had conversations with my mum, conversations with the lady I was living with. Everyone was aware I was going to leave, other than the school, who I was sort of quietly telling people, but not making like a big announcement about it. So it comes to my last day and I forgot to leave out PE kit. And so I emailed ahead I need a drink. I emailed ahead to the PE teachers and I was like, look, I'm leaving, don't have my kit, I'm sorry, I forgot to leave it out. And they're like, oh, okay. So I go to this and they're like, okay, so when are you leaving? And I was like, oh, at the end of the day. And they're like, so why don't you have your PE kit? I was like, it's packed. And they're like, what do you mean it's packed? And I was like, it's packed up with the rest of my stuff. It's at the bottom of a bag. And they were like, oh, you mean you're leaving the school? And I was like, yeah. And they were like, well, does anybody know about this? And I was like, well, yeah, some people know. And they were like, well, we weren't told anything about it. And I was like, well, yeah, you do now. And they were like, so, have you told your teacher, have you told your form tutor, so on and so forth? And I was like, well, no. And they were like, well, you need to say goodbye to people. And I was like, well, I'm doing that today. So the rest of the day comes, I go and see my old form tutor, I go and see all my old teachers, I say goodbye to students, so on and so forth. And hold on, I have pins and needles. And so it gets to my last lesson of the day, which is sociology. And at this point, it's gotten to my head of Key Stage, who was also my sociology teacher. And so I'm chatting to her about it, and we find out that the other student in the class, there were only 2 other students, wasn't coming. So we're having a chat about it, and she gets an email. And she's sat at, I'm getting attacked by a teddy bear. And she looks at her laptop and she goes, oh, okay then. And I was like, is everything all right, miss? She goes, yeah, someone's going to come down and talk to you. And I was like, that's ominous. And she was like, a bit, yeah. Would you prefer that I stay in the room or left? And I was like, stay in the room. It's all cool. And so the deputy head of care shows up and he sits down in his seat. He crosses his arms, and he crosses his legs and he leans back and we exchange pleasantries. And then he says, so I've heard you're leaving. I was like, yeah. And he was like, well, I didn't know anything about this. And I said, well, I was told that you were under a legal obligation to tell my local authority that I wasn't living in that catchment area, and thus they're going to pull funding anyway. And to be honest, I haven't really been enjoying going to school here for a while. And he said, well, I didn't know anything about this. And I said, well, I haven't exactly been quiet about, not being happy here. And he says, so what's wrong with this school? And so I list off all about, how the accommodation isn't great, how the lessons weren't, what's the word, they weren't very formal, and often teachers or students just didn't show up, and so work just didn't get done. About how even though it was a blind school, there was a lot of limitations on what you could do as a student outside of the school, and also how that depended on the amount of sight that you would have. So for instance, I wasn't allowed to go out into town or anything because of my level of sight. They all said it was because I hadn't passed the route, but the boys in the year above me have been going into town by themselves from the age of, I think, 15, 14, I think. And they were all like, oh, we just got our parents to give permission. I was like, okay then. So I went to, the members of staff, said, oh, my parent gives permission, can I go? They're like, no, you haven't passed the route. And I was like, oh, okay then. And there were several other incidences like that where it was very clear that the amount of sight you had depended on what you were allowed to do. So I told him about that, told him everything that I didn't like, and he goes, well, I still don't think you should go. And I was like, well, as I said, I've not really got any choice, I've got to leave anyway because of the funding. And he goes, well, I haven't actually told them yet. I was like, well, it's been, however many days, and you said you were going to do it. You said you had a legal obligation. He was like, well, I wouldn't say I have a legal obligation, more like a moral obligation. And I was like, well, I was told a legal obligation that it was happening and that the funding was going to be pulled from Christmas. And he was like, well, I haven't told them yet. So I was like, so why did you say that you were going to tell them if you haven't told them? And he goes, well, and I go, well, the local authority funds for the school. If I don't have funding for this school, then I can't go to this school, and I'm unhappy here anyway, so I'm leaving. And then I say again, so why did you tell me, why did you tell my family that you had a legal obligation to tell the authority and you were going to tell the authority if you didn't? And he goes, well, you see how it works is the local authority fund for you to come here. So I need to tell them. And I go, I've just said that to you. You're just repeating back to me what I've just said. I've just said that to you. Why did you say that you were going to tell the authority if you haven't? And then we just go round and round and round and round and round and round in circles for, I kid you not, 20-25 minutes. Round and round and round and round in circles. And I am starting to lose it. I'm starting to lose my patience with this man. I just keep repeating, why did you say you were going to do this when you have not done this? And he just kept going round and round in circles. And I was like, stop. This conversation is going nowhere. You're not answering my question. You just keep slithering out of it. And to be honest, this is absolute bullshit and you're taking the piss. I literally said that to him. And I was like, excuse my language, but you are full of bullshit and taking the absolute piss. And he was like, oh, well, And then the teacher who had been sat there the entire time, he goes, I think maybe it's time for us to take a break. I think, if you don't mind, I think this is the end of this conversation, and I think you should go now, basically, to the deputy head of care. And I just sit there, we watch him leave, and he's shaken. He's definitely shaken. And he shut the door, closes behind him, and the teacher goes, I'm not saying anything, I'm not commenting, but you did very well there. That was tricky to deal with. You did very well. And I was like, thank you, miss. And I am shaking. I am so angry. So angry. And I blew up at this man, and I don't remember exactly what I said, but before he left I absolutely blew up at this man, and I was like, I could have done this more officially. I could have got another school placement lined up. I'd been to view a school at this point, but hadn't got a placement lined up. I was just like, I'm just going to leave. I'm not going to have the funding. I'll just leave. I've got an appointment to go and see this school again, to go and sort things out. I can get a placement for after October half term. It hadn't been confirmed yet, but I was pretty sure I'd get one. So basically, I was just like, I'm just going to continue with what I'm doing. I'm going to leave. So we end up going on a walk, me and this teacher. And then I get back, and it's the end of the school day. So I go back to back to the hostel. That's what they called the accommodation for 16 plus. Go back, and I've got all my stuff packed, and I'm just waiting to come and be picked up. And I walk in, and I go upstairs, and then someone knocks on my door, and they're like, oh, we need you to come down. I was like, why? And they're like, we just need you to come down. I was like, okay then. So I walk on down, go to the office, and I'm like, hi, I was told you wanted to talk to me. And they're like, oh, do we? And I was like, yeah. And I'm like, oh, and then I hear from like, so there were several rooms that were like where the staff were, and I hear from one of the other rooms a call through going, oh, Kira, yeah, come through here. I was like, okay then, mosey on through, and I'm like, what's going on? They're like, so we've heard that you're leaving. I was like, yeah. And they're like, well, we heard nothing about this. And I was like, well, I've kept it quiet, but not that quiet. And they're like, oh, well, why are you leaving? And so I reiterate how unhappy I was and so on and so forth, and I tell them about the conversation earlier, and I was like, this place is just a piece of shit, basically. I don't want to be here. It's not good for my mental health. I'm going to leave. And they were like, well, you might not be able to get a school placement. And I was like, to be honest, I'm pretty sure I will. And if not, then I don't think being here is best for my mental health, and I can always go online and so on and so forth. We're like, oh, okay. When are you leaving? I was like, well, someone's on the way to pick me up now. And they're like, oh, aren't you going to pack your things? I was like, they're already packed. You're supposed to do room checks. Are you not aware? The place was so inefficient. So I continue, and they're like, well, when they get here, we want to have a conversation with them, whoever's picking you up. I was like, okay then. Well, they're coming past Birmingham at rush hour, so it might be a couple of hours. And they're like, okay. But the deputy head of care still wants to talk to them. I was like, okay then, cool. So I go upstairs, you know, maybe pick up last few minutes, put them in bags, so on and so forth. Go down when the lady who was picking me up is there. And I'm like, okay, so you want to have a meeting with us? And they're like, oh, well, he's gone home now. I was like, doesn't he live on campus? And they're like, yeah, but he's out of hours now. And I was like, so he didn't want to have a conversation like that then, did he? Okay, cool. And they're like, so we're going to have a chat. And so we had a chat. And I spoke to them about things, and they tried to convince me to stay, and they were like, I know it's a bit embarrassing now. And I was like, it's not embarrassing. I want to go. I'm going. I'm gone. Like, you can't change my mind. And it wouldn't be embarrassing if I did change my mind. And I'm like, maybe you should just leave a bag, you know, just make it look like you're staying. I was like, okay, fine, I'll leave a bag, whatever, I just want to get out of here. So I think I left a dressing gown minus the cord, because dressing gown cords are like gold dust, and a towel in a bag, and I think that was it, and like a bag for life, and just left that on the desk. Took everything else, and that was it. That was my last day. I don't know if that's overly interesting to anyone, but I just thought that it was ridiculous the way that they tried to convince me to stay, but not all the members of staff were even aware of what was going on. It just illustrates perfectly how rubbish the school was. And also, before I left, I used the guest toilet because we'd been ferrying things up and down. So I went in there and I was just reminded why I wanted to leave. I sat down on the loo and it moved a foot backwards, and I grabbed onto things either side of me and they all moved foot backwards, and I was like, oh my god, okay, yeah, I remember why. And then I went to get some loo roll. The loo roll holder was broken, but there was some that was sort of drunkenly standing on the edge of the back of the toilet from all of the rocking around. I used it, got some paper cuts. I was like, yeah, that's why I'm leaving. Use the tap. Oh, that one doesn't work, I forgot about that. Tried to use the other one, got a dribble, turned it a bit faster, splashed up everywhere, there was no soap. I was like, yeah, this is why I'm leaving. And I have not regretted leaving, even though I wasn't able to get that school placement. I don't regret leaving at all, even a little bit. Yeah, so that was my last day and sort of what happened around me leaving the boarding school. If you've got any questions, leave them down below. It's kind of a vague one because I don't want to get anybody in trouble, but yeah, absolutely ridiculous.